Eric, we have a big announcement in this episode today.
We do, and this is something that I think it's for a good cause, okay? It's for a good reason. We do have unquantified algorithms that we don't understand that tell us to do this, but you're just going to have to trust us. We're not following through with one promise that we have always historically made on Iron Culture, but it will be worth it. That's all I can say. Omar, do you want to drop the bad news?
So we say at the end of every single episode, we'll catch you every single Monday. However, next Monday, what date is that, Eric? Is it the 28th? Would it be the 28th?
It would be the 28th.
Of March?
28th of March.
We will not be releasing an episode because we're releasing an episode that Friday, April 1st. And we're dead serious. The next episode after this one will be on Friday, not Monday. So please, we apologize for the inconvenience. The corporate cabal, the higher-ups, they send... It's top down, okay? We're atop the pyramid. They're atop whatever they are, the ziggurat. It's nothing like a pyramid. Just telling us what to do. We're beholden to them. They said, don't release it on Monday. And we said, why? And they said, don't ask. And here we are.
So we feel like that's a good enough reason for us.
Sufficient.
Because, you got to please the powers that be. But we're not going to let that stop us from still having the same number of episodes. Their frequency is different, really.
Yeah.
This is just a different type of program where you manipulate the frequency rather than the volume or the intensity, because we're bringing that intensity. It's going to be a good episode. It's just going to come on a different day. And then you're going to be like, oh, I had to wait so long. But then you're going to be like, oh, I didn't have to wait that long for the next one, because after the episode on the 1st, we're going to have an episode on the 4th. So we're going to have to wait half a week. So that's... We're just going to create kind of an abusive relationship and then bring you right back. So you'll feel wronged by us, and then you'll feel righted, and it all will be well. So don't worry about it. And without further ado, really excited to bring on for his first solo appearance after 2 roundtable appearances, the ingenious, which I'm sure makes him uncomfortable to call him that, which is why I like calling him that, Andrew Vigotsky, who is going to be talking to us today about the limitations of EMG, as well as maybe the right perspective on how to use science to inform exercise selection.
No, Eric, fantastic. This episode, I do say often, but it's the truth. We're not missing with these episodes. It's a monster episode because there's the meme of EMG, or what people think they know about it, or its utility as it relates to hypertrophy or exercising in general, how to make an informed choice. And what Andrew does so eloquently is basically just kick down the door, challenge all previously held assumptions, and then in true Iron Culture fashion, we have that meta conversation after the discussion on EMG about exercise selection, guiding principles. We even talk about the use of science as a marketing tool. Like we go anywhere and everywhere with Andrew because he's a careful, considerate, smart individual that can go those places. So we talk about the topic du jour, and then it opens up unlimited possibilities.
Well said.
Eric, would you agree with the following? That Iron Culture is timeless.
I would agree with that.
Fantastic. So I have phenomenal news for you. I just came back. I just used our patented time machine. We have Andrew Vigotsky here. I'm here to share the latest information, folks, on EMG. I have this tab open. It's a website. For legal purposes, I can't say what it is, but we all know the following, Andrew, that EMG is commonly used to measure the level of muscle activation and provides a rough estimate of exercise intensity for specific muscles involved in a movement. Cool. And we know from that we can extrapolate roughly the utility of certain movements based upon their EMG activity. So I'm hoping that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm sure over the last 11 years, there's been 0 updates regarding EMG since that time, because it's kind of like an open and shut case. But yeah, I'm just excited for this update.
Andrew, welcome to the podcast. And Omar, from, I think, 1 year before we started communicating online, great to have you on your Future Selves podcast as well.
Thank you.
I have so many questions about the theory of relativity and time travel now, but I think those are far less important than if we just collect enough EMG studies.
You're right.
Every bodybuilder will be able to have the perfect exercise selection. They'll know which head of the delts, there's only 3, and they function in very different ways and not together, can be used during which exercises. And we can just look at these fantastic bar graphs, and then boom, I can write an evidence-based program. And after each exercise, here's the goal. And this is the goal in evidence-based. I'm going to keep using that word a lot just to make Andrew happy. in the evidence-based community, when you have an Excel
EBC,
spreadsheet,
yeah.
and yes, we are using Excel because we're 2011. We're not using these Google Sheets. I don't know about clouds. They sound dangerous, okay?
I don't even know what they are.
Excel spread. They don't exist. Don't worry about it. So we have these Excel spreadsheets, but after every exercise, I want to have a citation of an EMG study that shows that it produces the highest relative activation towards, whatever the hell that means, okay? Andrew, what do you think? Yeah, how much have you thrown up in your mouth in the last 5 minutes? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, that's a mouthful. A vomit, I suppose. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. First things first. EMG is not necessarily a measure of muscle activation. I can get back to that later, but perhaps most importantly, we really don't have robust evidence to demonstrate that EMG amplitude measured cross-sectionally or during an acute session is predictive of longitudinal growth. So if I compare two biceps exercises and I see one has greater surface EMG amplitude than another, we don't have good evidence to suggest that that means that the exercise that elicits greater amplitude will result in greater hypertrophy in the long term. And even if we break things down mechanistically and kind of draw a causal chain as to what should happen, so EMG amplitude should reflect the excitation of the muscle. Excitation of the muscle leads to activation of the muscle. Activation of the muscle leads to force, and that force accumulation over time leads to hypertrophy via mechanosensation. But each of those premises kind of stand on weak ground. So in my view, both due to the lack of longitudinal evidence directly supporting the relationship between surface EMG amplitude and hypertrophy, and also the fact that each of these premises aren't necessarily super strong, I don't think there's a lot of ground to stand on there. So, Eric, I would not go with your spreadsheet approach to designing programs.
Okay, well, that's kind of good because I haven't figured out how to extend the cell long enough without not allowing the other cells to fit on one page to have the author names. And then I've been trying to purposely select papers where the authors have short last names like Smith and like Lee. But apparently I just need to wait a few more years for more EMG stuff to come out from short name authors. That's kind of the way I have my evidential hierarchy. Is the name short enough to fit on my Excel spreadsheet, and then that therefore is the best evidence. So it sounds like you and I, Andrew, maybe use different hierarchies of evidence, and that's okay, differences of opinion. Yeah. But Omar, I get the sense that you probably just want to get back in that time machine and go right back to 2011 to the good old days.
Yeah, all I can say when Andrew eloquently refuted the definition that I used from a 2011 article would be if you just read this T Nation article, Andrew, I think it's going to blow your mind. Like, I know you're dealing with 2022 evidence, but there's some golden nuggets here. And there's an attached program. So my one question for you is, have you tried their attached program that uses EMG to predict some of the movement? Have you tried their program? Yes or no?
No, I have not.
Telling. Okay.
You know what? I would bet that he's not even using Anaconda in conjunction with it.
Bro!
Which tends to make everything just work a little more the way T Nation says it will. So all I got to say is, folks, we've taught you on Iron Culture to be skeptical. So there are some potential things you should be skeptical about. Everything you hear that comes out of Andrew's mouth for the next, hour or however long he allows us to keep talking to him. All right.
In his office.
So I'm gonna break kayfabe here just for a second. First off, I just want to say it is an honor to get Andrew Vigotsky back on. Is this your third or fourth appearance now?
Third. Well, so I was on with others the first two times, so maybe it's only my second.
No, that counts. No. So this is actually your fourth then, I believe. Right? If you've had two, because this is your second time on individually?
Second solo?
No. First solo, I think, because I was on with Greg Knuckles before, right?
Yep.
And I was on with Megan.
Right.
Yes. This is third. This counts.
So it's really your first time is what you're saying. You said, you implied that...
This is those were half times, right? Because I was with someone else, so...
Yeah.
Well, we actually need to go back and measure the relative contribution in each one of those. And maybe if we had a maximal voluntary contribution, I would call it an MVC, to see how much you could give in one podcast. So what we need is actually to finish this podcast, right, and then see how much talking time there was, and then we can measure the percentage of talking time in those previous ones compared to this, and then we'd have an idea of how to count it, and we could just take the root mean square of that time, and we're good. If anyone understood that joke who wasn't Andrew, pat yourself on the back. So anyway, honored to have you back on. For those who don't know, Andrew has done a lot of, I would say, very important communication within the science community. So y'all think that science communication is just about, us talking to people who don't science about how to better understand the science. Well, Andrew's on the level where he's like, y'all scientists don't know how to science. Let me tell you scientists how to science, become a better sciencer. And that's typically the official way it's put out. But anyway, he has a couple of really awesome papers. One came out really recently, which is cleverly titled, Longing for a Longitudinal Proxy, Acutely Measured Surface EMG Amplitude is Not a Validated Predictor of Muscle Hypertrophy. It's all in the title, but in this episode, we're going to break down why that is and the different aspects of it, and really try to put EMG research into context. And even prior to that, for those who really want to dig into it, and both of these are open access, so you can read them. In 2017, I think it got published in full in 2018, Interpreting Signal Amplitudes in Surface Electromyography Studies in Sport and Rehabilitation Sciences. So those are both great articles that I've read, and just really an effort to get things wrong less when I talk about this stuff. Those are both lead authored by Andrew, and we're really happy to have you on. So thanks for joining us again, man.
Thank you. I appreciate the time to spread my gospel.
I love it. We're all going to be converted by the end of this, I'm sure. So I think, Omar, you did a great job of kind of being the meme of the quote unquote evidence-based trainer or potentially bodybuilding interested person, where essentially what I think happens is anytime we have any potential proxy of a measurement, especially in the absence of longitudinal data, which is hard to collect, it will very quickly come to the forefront in people who are science interested, often before the point at which it can be validated and confirmed to represent what it does. And I think this is a natural aspect of curiosity, but it is one that I think does repeatedly, if you look at the history of exercise science, cause problems because there are assumptions made. So, I mean, I can think of so many examples. The assumption that acute elevations in hormones post-exercise are what is actually causing training long-term without actually validating those relationships, long-term. That's data that's been around since the 90s, and it wasn't until the late 2000s where people really put their hand up and said, hey, hold on, can we slow the bus down a little bit and maybe even take a left instead of a right? And there are other examples, mechanisms of hypertrophy that we know for sure are correlated, but we don't actually have solid causative evidence to indicate that they're part of the process which induces it. Or the data on muscle protein synthesis, where we're looking at snapshots of amino acid kinetics in response to training and feeding, or the combination thereof, that may or may not represent longitudinal outcomes in hypertrophy. And I think EMG is kind of the biomechanics world of this, right? So I would really love to hear more about this. So first off, you planted a seed that is just going to really make it very difficult to talk about this at all. You said that EMG can't be used to describe activation. And I don't even know how to speak anymore, because anytime I go to any kind of conference or you talk to bodybuilders, anyone who's a little sciencey, they're like, that's a good exercise because it really activates these. And then they start talking about EMG research. So why can't we say the word activation? Why is that? Is this just the PC police? Is there something wrong with activation? Did that get canceled?
So I wouldn't say can't, but you can with certain assumptions or certain models. But basically, the world that I come from, so I studied muscle more from an engineering perspective and modeling perspective. But when you really understand the physiology, so how does a muscle contract? Well, you have an action potential.
Oh, I'm so glad you answered that. I thought I was going to have to. I got really nervous. All right, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, so you have an action potential that comes from the central nervous system, right? So it goes down the motor neuron, gets to the motor end plate, then it excites the sarcolemma, so the muscle fiber membrane, and then that action potential travels across the muscle fiber membrane. That causes the release of calcium. That calcium binds to troponins who allow the actin and myosin to bind and actually create a cross bridge and force. And so these are different processes. So it takes time for the calcium to travel through the muscle to eventually bind to the troponin. And so when you think about what the EMG actually measures, it's the action potential traveling across the muscle fiber membrane. But a muscle activating is, if you look at the biophysics literature, it's the calcium binding to the troponin, because that's what enables the cross bridging.
Right.
So in the biophysics literature, it's more defined as the relative amount of calcium bound to troponin. And since that process takes time, what you measure using EMG is not necessarily representative of the calcium that's bound.
Gotcha. So we are actually measuring muscle excitation, which precedes activation. So it's the electrical signal rather than the cascade that occurs after that action potential. Excellent. So then my response to that, as someone who doesn't want to feel like I was wrong for decades, is, but why does that matter, bro? One immediately precedes the other. So aren't we basically measuring activation in proxy?
Well, it depends on the type of contraction you're studying. So these things can be modeled using a transfer function or differential equation. But if the system is not changing its state, so if you have, let's say, a non-fatiguing isometric condition, that's a perfectly valid assumption. But if you think of something like a dynamic contraction, where the state of the muscle is actually changing, then that's not necessarily the case. Also, you have to take into account that what you're measuring is a proxy for excitation. It's not excitation itself. And so when you're moving a muscle, its pennation angle is changing, its fiber length is changing. And so that's going to change the properties of the signal itself. So for example, there was a study published in 2017 by Tayan Vieira and colleagues. And what they did was they put electrodes on the tibialis anterior, and they stimulated the nerve that excites the tibialis anterior. And what they did was they stimulated the tibialis anterior in 3 different joint angles. So when the ankle is in plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, and neutral. Okay, so what they showed was when you stimulate the tibialis anterior, when you're in dorsiflexion, so a shortened position, the amplitude that you get is roughly double what you get when the ankle is in plantar flexion.
Okay.
So that's for the same exact neural input to the muscle. So the muscle is being excited the exact same way, but you see half the amplitude. And that effect is created just by changing the geometry of the muscle relative to the electrode. So what you're picking up on surface EMG, especially during these dynamic exercises, is at best a proxy for excitation, but note that it's a biased proxy. Gotcha.
And that's pretty important. So assuming there's a similar relationship in other muscles, which you'd think there would be, if we were doing a calf raise where you're moving from dorsiflexion into plantar flexion repeatedly, not just comparing 3 isometric contractions, and then of course the gastrocnemius and the soleus are 2 muscles layered on top of one another. You can't even really get access to the soleus effectively with EMG, and it's a thicker muscle than the anterior tibialis, then you probably have the same problem, if not amplified, because now we're looking at something dynamic. Would you say that's an accurate logic train there?
I mean, you would have similar problems. The degree of bias, it's hard to intuit because it's a very nonlinear process. So it's difficult because, so the medial gastrocnemius, for example, is pretty pennated, right? Whereas if you look at the architecture of the tibialis anterior, it's relatively parallel. So when you're, so the difference between parallel to a little bit of pennation might have a larger effect than being pennated to more pennated. So I I wouldn't know without seeing actual data, but it's hard to intuit.
But that's a really good point. So I think, can we briefly talk about muscle architecture for those who aren't familiar with those morphological descriptions? So what is muscle pennation?
Okay, so if you look at a muscle, it's wrapped in a sheath of connective tissue. And so each of the fibers, they don't insert straight into a tendon, they insert into connective tissue called an aponeurosis. And they don't necessarily do so in a way that's straight. So depending on the muscle, sometimes they insert at so for example, if this is an aponeurosis, some muscles are like this, some muscles are like this. And so the degree at which they insert into the aponeurosis is called the pennation angle.
And all you got to think about is Kai Green's quads to really put this into the understanding of the type of listeners we have here. You know, you don't see those striations running just directly up the whole length of the vastus lateralis. They got those cross striations, which are sick, most importantly, but also that is a different type of muscle architecture than you might see in, say, the biceps, which are fusiform. You know, it does run more or less, parallel to the angle of the muscle attachments. So that's very helpful. So I guess what you're saying, Andrew, is that when we look at different muscles of different architecture, that can potentially drastically change how we'd interpret signal data from EMG in a way that might make comparisons to synergists, or even within the same muscle in different exercises, if they are performed in a different way, invalid.
That's correct. Yeah. So if within the tibialis anterior, you see double the amplitude just by changing the joint angle for the same input, then it stands to reason that you probably shouldn't compare between two joint angles in the same muscle unless you know that that bias is negligible, which we do not know for most muscles.
Gotcha. So that sounds like we can't do something like, even if we take the same person and we do, crossover design, and we hook some EMG up to their, vastus, their vasti muscles, get an assessment of their quads, and we have them do squats and then leg extensions. We can't therefore say that the squat or leg extension is better than the other because of a higher EMG amplitude on one or the other.
Yeah, that's correct. And so it's especially apparent here because I think if you look at the resistance curve of the squats and the resistance curve of the knee extensions, they're quite different, right? Like the squat isn't providing much knee extension resistance when someone is near full knee extension.
Yep.
And that's when it's in the shortest position. And so that could also be when you're able to elicit greater surface EMG amplitude. So that itself could create a bias. So just due to differences in the torque angle relationship.
So it is not just necessarily a joint angle, but also the torque angle relationship. So you're telling me that if I was to take the same person and I did, let's say a dumbbell lateral raise versus a cable lateral raise, where the biomechanics, at least the kinematics are similar, there would be an issue because of potentially where the torque angle relationship is in the dumbbell. Obviously, you have a lot more force that you have to apply at full, or I should say it's biased more towards when you're at full flexion versus in the cable where it's more constant throughout. Would that be an invalid comparison as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable making that comparison. And like even practically, so we have this recent work showing, or at least suggesting, that longer muscle lengths are more beneficial for hypertrophy than shorter muscle lengths, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take that as a general principle, I'm not sure we're there yet, but it could be that cable lateral raises would be more efficacious than dumbbell lateral raise. But maybe the dumbbell lateral raise were to get higher surface EMG amplitude because it provides more resistance at a shorter joint angle. And so we're really just kind of making assumptions about, we're ignoring any sort of bias in the signal, and two, we're making assumptions about how the system works and how the system adapts.
Gotcha. All right. So I'm trying to keep 2011 Omar from having a true mental breakdown here. Okay. What if we compare different types of squats though? Like what if we got a front squat or a back squat or a safety bar squat? Very similar biomechanics-ish, at least more similar than a leg extension and a squat. We should have pretty similar relationships in joint angle and torque angle and all that good stuff. How we doing now? Same person, crossover study, same muscle versus same muscle within the same person, different exercises. Now we got to be somewhere, right? I know if front squats are better than back squats, right?
I mean, I haven't. It's been a while since I've looked at the mechanics of these, but I mean, it's arguably a little bit more acceptable. But even still, like, you're getting back. You're starting to get to the point where you're comparing exercises that are so close. It becomes a question of like, are you really comparing different exercises?
I mean, one's called a front squat, one's called a back squat, Andrew. I feel like that
one almost chokes me out, the other one doesn't. There's a significant
face
difference.
validity right there. I mean, come on.
But no, they do have different like knee ranges of motion, right?
True.
So who's to say that that could bias one of them? I'm not sure. But ultimately, if you're interested in hypertrophy, why not do the study? Like if that's the outcome of interest, measure the outcome of interest. That is hard, but who said this stuff has to be easy?
Well, then you also have to you got to get more than 10 people. You got to get another group, or if you do a crossover, then you got to bring them back for another 8 weeks. What if I'm just trying to pad my publications by just putting electrodes on 5 people, and then I'm done with the study in a week? I mean, you got to think about the pros and cons here, Andrew. And it sounds like I took a shot at every EMG research. I'm kidding. For the record, I don't think that is the the purpose of all EMG research. I do, however, think that the complexity of this topic is something that has not been considered sufficiently. And I'll speak for myself. It honestly has not been until reading a lot of your work and having discussions with you where I've fully understood the limitations. So I do think you're doing an incredible service to EMG researchers. And for something for people to consider, like, the strength conditioning field is one where you kind of have to be a generalist. You need to understand a lot of various topics. And to some degree, unless you're just a really, really intelligent person and a true Renaissance researcher, you're going to lack the true depth on each one of these topics, and you may make some methodological errors. So it's really important for anyone who does get into S&C research. If you want to venture outside of just the really applied nature of longitudinal studies and, hey, we did this, the other group did this, and we looked at these outcomes, so therefore we can make some inferences about which was better in the circumstance. But if you do want to get into mechanisms, you really do need to consult with the people who have the specific mechanistic experience and knowledge, and that is domain specific. And that's really the importance of open science and multidisciplinary approaches. So I would just put that out there. Andrew, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Not on that specifically, but I do kind of want to back up a little bit. So going back to the squat example, so if you think about, even if the mechanics are fairly well matched, there are a number of other steps or assumptions you have to make in order to get to hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So let's say you grant that the excitation measurements don't have bias. Well, now you have to say, okay, that those measurements are accurately representative of the activation of the muscle, so that the actual biophysical dynamics aren't different. So even then, if you grant that, let's say the activation is a fair assumption, then you get to, okay, well, is the actual force that these are producing, is that similarly resulting in muscle protein synthesis? And does that muscle protein synthesis actually carry over to greater hypertrophy? And I mean, the muscle protein synthesis work is a little bit messy, as you know, and as you mentioned, there are certain things that need to be controlled for with it. And I think it makes that question a little bit difficult to answer. Yep. But for example, it doesn't seem to be the case that surface EMG amplitude necessarily maps onto anabolic signaling.
Right.
which is kind of related to muscle protein synthesis, right? So in my mind, like there are all these mechanistic steps, and they should all kind of fall right in line with one another in order for those assumptions to hold, and they don't seem to really fall in line with each other, at least not consistently.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Omar, don't go ahead. Sorry, Andrew.
That's not to say that that's not to say it never works and that it can't work. So there
Gotcha.
are situations where surface EMG amplitudes do seem to reflect hypertrophy. So one good example is like single joint versus multi-joint, looking at like rectus femoris. So rectus femoris, you don't see a whole lot of surface EMG amplitude with multi-joint exercises, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because if the rectus femoris was producing force, then that would kind of resist hip extension, and that doesn't seem too efficient. But EMG amplitudes are pretty high for the rectus femoris with just plain old knee extensions. And then if you look at the hypertrophy literature seems to reflect that relationship. Likewise for the hamstrings.
Yep. So this gets us to a useful application of EMG is whether or not a muscle is quote unquote on or off in a more binary sense in a movement. And as you just hinted at, there are some compound movements that, due to the complexity of the body, we're looking at, the use of synergists, which are potentially, you might, without thinking too deeply, think, oh, of course they'd be involved. Like the hamstrings, yeah, those are they're also hip extensors. They're not just knee flexors, but they can't choose which joint action they do. They act on both. So it would not make sense for them to be active because it would actually oppose knee extension, right? And we've discussed this prior, Omar, if you remember, where we've talked about exercise selection.
Yep.
Yeah, biarticular muscles and their role in compound exercises where they would be opposing one of the other joint actions involved. So I think that's something that Iron Culture listeners will understand, and that I think is valuable. So if there's actually a debate around whether a muscle is involved as a prime mover or a synergist in a compound movement, I think that's probably a useful application of EMG. Is that something you'd agree with, Andrew?
Somewhat. So I look at this more of a basic motor control perspective, right? And so this is trying to understand how muscles work together.
Right.
And from that, you kind of get a principle. And then you use that principle for exercise selection. But this is also in line with kind of basic biomechanics. So, or even if you look at the neurophysiology of the spinal cord. Eccles's work from, was it the 40s or 50s? So if you look at these classic studies, all of this kind of makes sense. But for example,
I'll take your word for it.
From the 40s and 50s. The earliest research I
domain
think I've
specific. I'm very familiar with, like, for example, some of the nutrition research from that time period, like Ansel Keys stuff, some of the fundamental things of understanding the effect of low energy availability. Domain specific
say like
expertise,
1978,
folks.
1984. It's like, oh, from the 40s and 50s. I'm like, that's probably the earliest reference studies, maybe on iron culture yet.
No, because when we went over testosterone, I was talking about
True.
stuff from the early 1900s. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on.
He was a student of Sherrington who published in the early 1900s. But Eccles's work. So that's on like reciprocal inhibition. And basically, like, for example, the quadriceps would tend to reciprocally inhibit the hamstrings and so on and so forth. Anyway, but this is very consistent with the model that I created with Megan Jones.
Right.
I'm not sure if you've seen that abstract, but just from the biomechanics of the exercise alone, you can predict that both the rectus femoris and the hamstrings won't be very active. So from that standpoint, I would say EMG at best provides supporting evidence, but that evidence isn't necessary. And it's also not providing evidence in a circumstance where there's something called clinical equipoise. And I'm not sure if you've heard that term before, but clinical equipoise is often used in the medical and randomized control trial literature. And the idea is you don't run a study unless you're really unsure about what the outcome would be. And because there's such a strong physiological prior, in a sense, as to what the outcome of the surface EMG study would be, is there equipoise? And if there's not equipoise, then what are you learning from the surface EMG study?
So Andrew, that's not how we do it in the sport and exercise field. So what we do is we do the initial study, and then you change the length of the study and you get another publication. And then you make a slight alteration to the population you study, like, people over 40, or, and actually this isn't a good example, the opposite sex, because sometimes there are very relevant physiological differences. Then you change the exercise selection a little bit. Then you add another random supplement into another group. And then you also change the, there's a lot of things you can do. You add one other extra measurement on there. And then you can get 6 publications that all tell you the same thing, but sometimes they don't because your sample size is too low, and then it just muddies the water. So I can see how maybe you do it one way, but we do it a different way here in sports science. So, different strokes, different folks.
I will say, Eric, I think, Andrew, if we're to try and steelman maybe EMG researchers a bit, because I feel like you're already dismantling a lot of the commonly held assumptions, what would be if you were to play maybe a devil's advocate to yourself, where you said measure the outcome instead, like this whole proxy that EMG is attempting to use, how it's erroneous for several different reasons, and I don't know, like I can't even construct, I think, the argument that would be compelling on the other side. Maybe EMG researchers would cite the idea, if you're trying to measure outcome as it relates to hypertrophy, how that in and of itself could be messy, yada, yada, yada. What would be some potential counter arguments, I'm wondering, from EMG researchers to some of the base.
I tried, Omar.
Yeah, because I'm just
Andrew is
just
smarter than me. Let's see if we can get him to argue with himself.
Argue with yourself. No, just because it's like, if this holds true, we're going right down the line of thinking. But surely there are some EMG researchers, not that must have thought of this, but it seems when you described before the podcast, such a sunk cost where you're just like, inhabiting the system that's faulty inherently. That might be part of it, but surely there must be some counter arguments, however weak, that they've used to some of these things brought up. Yes or no?
So I've argued a lot with myself about this.
Okay, great.
Basically, the question is like, okay, so can you design a study where you'd fully trust that these results would translate? Or if you were to design a study to try to best isolate surface EMG to try to validate it as a predictor, how would you design that? And one thing that comes to mind to me, so we have to start thinking about how many different things can we control. And so getting rid of the dynamic aspect of exercise would be the first thing. So you have isometric exercise. So let's take an isometric elbow flexion. Same joint angle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so let's even do the same intensity of load.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're controlling for quite a bit. And let's say I want to compare, I guess, internal versus external focus.
Yep.
Which seems like a reasonable thing, right? And then, so you have this isometric exercise, internal versus external focus. What then is changing between so do you go to failure with those exercises?
You would have
or do you do it for a standard duration of time?
Yeah, you'd have to choose how you wanted to compare the two, and then which one is more valid and which one actually answers the question.
Yeah, so like I could argue the more ecological one is to go to failure. And so if you go to failure, even if you measure differences, then you introduce a non-stationarity because you're introducing fatigue. And in addition, who's to say that going to failure doesn't swamp any differences in surface EMG in the long run? Especially with what we know about the high versus low load literature. So it's really hard in my mind to come up with instances where every single variable can be controlled for in a way that I would know in the long term that it wouldn't confound the results, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think actually let's take a step back in that logic train, because someone listening might go, okay, look, if we can't compare exercises, why don't we compare, like you said, some other factors like attentional focus, or what you just hinted at, different loading with the same exercise at the same muscle. So, for example, if, and I'm going to ask the question instead of giving the answer here. If all of those things are true, why couldn't we just compare someone doing a set of 10 to failure or a set of 30 to failure and a set of 5 to failure on an exercise and see, which one had the greatest, I don't know, EMG area of the curve, if you will, and wouldn't that not predict hypertrophy?
What a great question. So yeah, as you know, that fails spectacularly.
Yeah.
On average, higher loads seem to win with greater average EMG amplitude. And in the long run, the hypertrophy is the same if you kind of match for effort or match for volume.
Yep.
And so, I mean, it becomes really hard to get a lot of volume with 5 reps. But if you do like 80% 1 rep max versus 30% 1 rep max, both to failure, longitudinal hypertrophy is the same, but 80% tends to show greater surface EMG amplitudes, from what I remember. And
it does.
Those were several controversial papers in 2014, 2015.
Yep.
And I think those have been squashed, I think.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question. Why do we think we're seeing different signal amplitudes in between those two loads? What is the discrepancy there? Since we've controlled for things like changes in muscle geometry and we've got the same individuals performing the same biomechanical exercise, but we've just changed the load. Why are we seeing different signals?
So with 30%, you're doing a lot more repetitions. You're becoming a lot more fatigued, right? And with that fatigue, you see, I'm not talking about perceptual fatigue, but actually like fatigue within the muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's associated with changes in the biochemical environment of the muscle. And when you change the biochemical environment of the muscle, that changes the shape of the action potentials themselves as they travel across the membrane of the muscle fiber. So then that changes the actual content of the surface EMG. And that, when you go closer to failure, it can end up actually decreasing the amplitude of the surface EMG as a result. So it gets very complicated because the EMG first, in theory, increases, then decreases with fatigue. But yeah, basically, you're not comparing the same construct when you're looking at 80% and when you're looking at 30%. There could also be a number of other things that go on, like we discussed in our 2015 letter to the editor, the idea of motor unit cycling. So like with a lower load, it could be the case that some motor units turn on and some motor units turn off, giving the ones that turn off like a small break. I haven't seen any, or I don't recall any papers off the top of my head that strongly evidence that, but it's been proposed in the literature.
Yeah, I've seen some. Yeah, I think I've seen Steele cite some mechanistic studies on like fatiguing isometric contractions, where that's a very reasonable conclusion that motor unit cycling is happening, which I think is really interesting. Just the idea that there are different motor patterns to sustain a long-term fatiguing contraction need versus, going to failure at 80%. It's going to look different. The failure is to some degree happening for a different reason, if you will. So yeah, I think that's really, really interesting that you have to consider, what is going on and what is going into the reason why the performance is what it is and why one is high reps, why one is low reps. So I'm going to throw a slightly sideways question at you. So I agree that ideally you do the work, you do longitudinal studies, we see which exercises are better. However, I think we can all agree that there would be utility if we had a useful proxy that would allow us to look at this, because then it would reduce the burden of needing to do these harder things, right? So let's think about some other potential proxies that may exist. So for example, muscle oxygenation. So we got these MOXY units that are out there. That I've seen that proposed. Like for example, I know Qasim has talked about that from N1 Education. He also heavily leverages the biomechanics and muscle lengths and things like that he's interested in. But I've definitely seen him talk about the potential idea of measuring changes in muscle oxygenation, which is interesting. Or for example, MRI, looking at changes in the echo intensity after exercise to see if that indicates whether or not a muscle was active and maybe to what degree. Or you could potentially even look at something like the acute swelling response from ultrasound. What do you think about some of these other options? Are they too confounded? Do you have any high hopes, or do you have any low hopes? What are your thoughts there?
The best evidence I've seen for any of them so far is the T2 MRI. So looking at fluid shifts.
I can't remember which Terminator movie it was, but it's one of them. That's for sure. Yeah.
So there are a few studies now that show, at least indirectly, that these T2 measures seem to correlate with longitudinal growth. I think the evidence can be more robust in that area. I haven't seen anything on Moxie. I don't think I've seen anything on ultrasound changes in echo intensity predicting. I could be missing things there. You might know better than I. I don't really follow this literature too closely anymore.
Sure.
But in my mind, so this isn't to say EMG can never be used for this, or it's totally off the table. In our minds, there are a whole bunch of limitations and reasons to believe it might not work. We know it seems to provide some sort of relevant information in the case of the rectus femoris and hamstrings, and now there's a little bit of evidence for the gastrocs as well. But it would be great if we had something. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Especially something that's not as expensive as T2 MRI. And so, in my mind, the most fruitful work that could be done in this area is work that it actually attempts to validate surface EMG as a longitudinal predictor and really probes it. So it could be the case that it's valid in some conditions and not in other conditions. And establishing where it's valid and knowing the boundary conditions of that would be hugely important. And just think about how impactful that type of work would be on the field. It would give researchers the ability to actually use this and be able to make stronger conclusions without kind of like tiptoeing around their tacit goal. I think that work would be hugely important. And I don't know why it's not a priority of the field. I mean, I'm not in the field anymore. I do neuroscience brain research now.
We just keep pulling you back in, though. We won't let you. We won't. You're always going to be on Iron Culture. It doesn't matter. You're going to be like
10 years
NIH,
from now,
$2 million grant. And you're like, I'm really just trying to help people with muscular dystrophy, and we're like, no, you're not. Bodybuilding. So
muscle hypertrophy. Did someone say?
I don't even study muscle anymore. It's like dopaminergic neurons and striatum.
Where,
Andrew,
you know what? You're not breaking up with us. It's not going to happen. We're maintaining this codependent, unhealthy relationship.
Did you notice what Andrew was drinking this whole time he's poo-pooing EMG? He has a big old blue flask that I could only assume, due to the sheer size of it, it's Anaconda inside of there, because as we know, you needed 2 liters of water to properly dilute it. Weird that the water you're drinking, the container is about 2 liters big. I'm just saying.
It's actually 1 liter. But
that's one. Okay.
That's fine. You know, he drank the other one off camera.
Thank you. No, but I do think I just wanted to go back to some of that EMG research and the researchers. Not that I feel that we were letting them off too easy, but just because there was so much time invested in it. And I remember circa, I would say, the earlier part of last decade, an emphasis placed on it. And I think, of course, now we could say in hindsight, erroneously so, because maybe we are naturally as humans just comparative, and we want to know what's best in quotations, as if we could easily quantify those things. Andrew might say, oh, that's like being, you're like a naive empiricist. And then the bro would say, I just want to know, is a squat the movement for me, or, something like the leg extension. And I think the conversation that
you can't do both.
No, it's either or. It's either or, right? I'm in a monogamous relationship with a movement for a particular muscle group. And that's it for me.
At least when I make comments on Instagram, yes.
Right. And so I think the question, Eric, for you, do you have any other follow-up questions related to EMG? Because Andrew seems tired. He's like, I want to move on to like the fundamental question that we're trying to ask is all about exercise selection. Like, how do we make the best choices with exercises we want to choose for our particular goals? And EMG was a proxy of that. Is there anything else though that we want to digest? Because I feel like we've been dissecting it.
I've got one more, Omar, and I know you're like, please. I know what the cult needs and wants. They don't just want to hear you losing an argument with Andrew for an hour. So I have one more question, and that is, I 100% agree that it would be useful to do more attempts at validation work and finding out what conditions could EMG tell us something valuable, and using it in the course of a longitudinal study to see whether these baseline measurements or cross-sectional measurements at any time point really coincide with any kind of longitudinal outcome. So the fact that you highlighted that makes me want to ask the question, are we skeptical of EMG primarily because of some of the mechanistic shortcomings of EMG and what it can and can't tell us, and because we have evidence to suggest that the cross-sectional data doesn't match longitudinal outcomes? Or is it more so an issue of we have these mechanistic shortcomings that are theoretically a problem, and we lack the evidence comparing the cross-sectional to the longitudinal hypertrophy outcomes, or somewhere in between?
I would say it's halfway between the second thing you said and the third thing you said. So the mechanistic perspective really gives us a basis to evaluate these things and to kind of explicate the actual logic behind this. So as far as I know, nobody has really laid out the logic of why surface EMG should imply longitudinal hypertrophy.
You got to get on. You got to read some of these again. 2011 fantastic articles on T Nation, but we won't count those for this conversation. We'll keep it to the quote unquote published literature.
Yeah, I think when you actually evaluate that argument, that kind of gives you a strong reason to be skeptical.
Yeah.
All of the evidence that's out there, though, is indirect. So we could have a little bit of evidence for it. We could have a little bit of evidence against it. In my mind, as soon as we have a little bit of evidence against it, it in some sense says, okay, this isn't an open and shut case. Like, we can't just assume that this holds because it doesn't hold in all conditions. So then the question becomes, okay, when doesn't it hold, if it does even hold?
Right.
And so we were kind of explicit in that the studies that have been done, so we were linking like one study here to one study there. Most of these studies, or I don't even know if any of them have, actually in the same subjects in the same study actually develop a research question and develop the study protocol to try to evaluate this. So all the evidence we kind of pulled in with trying to make that connection is kind of piecemeal. So I think this needs to be done rigorously, and we can't really say too much out of the piecemeal evidence.
Right. So it sounds like it would be worthwhile to design a study, and maybe you can go, no, that's not what I meant by rigorous, Eric. I meant actually rigorous. You can design a study where you have a group of lifters perform at baseline, probably across a couple sessions, a number of exercises for a given muscle group. And you set up some standard for what is considered potentially, based on the limitations of EMG, the quote-unquote best exercise for the given muscle groups that we're going to be training. And then we assign people either to those that are supposed to be best, or maybe a random allocation or a standardized allocation in the other group, or the crossover. And then we actually take changes in muscle thickness or cross-sectional area over time for each one of those muscle groups. And given, like what you said about the limitations mechanistically with EMG, there's probably some issues with that, but at least that would show us that those issues were sufficient to make any kind of estimation of hypertrophy potential of these exercises, null. And we'd be able to tell whether or not people grew more or less, or it was the same, depending on which ones they chose.
Yeah, so we've kind of had ideas along those lines, but it really starts to get complicated when you try to hammer down the details. Like, okay, how do you actually choose the exercises? Do you do it on an individual level, or do you do it on a group level? And I guess you have to choose exercises, like the pool of exercises from which you choose have to be something with clinical equipoise, right?
Yep.
And so there are a lot of subjective calls, and I think it's hard to make these choices in a principled way. So I just think it requires a lot of thought, but I think something along those lines, at least from a practical perspective, could be hugely useful. And then you could do this in different muscles. You can do this with like different ranges, like exercises that seem to emphasize different ranges of motion, stuff like that, to maybe try to start to get at the boundary conditions of this. But yeah, it's a lot of work.
Absolutely. And I think if someone ever did want a cool master's or PhD project, this would be one to spend a whole lot of time to potentially just confirm what we already suspect, that EMG isn't that useful. But it would be a good service to the community. And it would firmly place 2011 Omar in a state of permanent depression. But hey, you got to get there. You can't bounce back if you don't hit rock bottom. Am I right? You know?
Andrew, what were you going to say?
But look, like it could be, like I said before, it could be that there are conditions where this holds. And knowing where this holds would be so big. And then we can focus our efforts where it does hold and not publish studies where it doesn't hold. And so in my mind, that makes scientific efforts that much more efficient and that much more fruitful. And just think about how many citations that study will get.
That's true.
Like you actually have a validation study for your...
Think about your H index. No, I totally agree. I'm being facetious. I 100% agree that it would be the kind of the linchpin of a change in paradigms with the way that EMG is used in sports science. While currently, I think the closest thing we have to that are actually your papers, but they are well-reasoned arguments that, like you said, are based on our understanding of the limitations of EMG rather than a direct comparison that actually, demonstrates that. So well said.
Thank you.
Omar, that's all I got.
Eric, thanks for hosting Andrew. Where can we find you, Andrew? No, I do think the interesting conversation, because EMG the whole time, they were attempting to use it as a proxy to measure something, to give better recommendations to lifters. And I think since 2011, Omar, on the old T Nation forums, it was actually, what's funny? It was 2010, the jumping off point. Like I made that joke randomly. That was a decade ago. But Anaconda really, Andrew, real quick before I get into it, do you remember Anaconda? I seem like I'm just dragging this company into the ground. But do you remember? Because I know you lifted back in 2011 and 10. Do you remember Anaconda?
Was it one of the T Nation supplements?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
He knows.
Yeah. So
I don't remember much more. Was it a testosterone booster?
I think it was like a quadruple dose of creatine was one of like the basic elements of it, Eric.
It was like an all and everything supplement that it was basically, I don't even remember. I think it was like carbs and creatine and protein. Am I right? You talk. I'll look it up.
And Andrew, I think the follow-up question here, the meta conversation, will be about exercise selection for particular goals. Like, how do we come about making these choices? And there is, I think, in the community, why EMG was so prevalent amongst, like, let's say, science adjacent individuals, is that there's the FOMO, the fear of always missing out. I'm doing this, but is this best? And if you have numbers, however, not concrete they are, it at least provides some comfort to the assumptions one makes about their own training and the goals that they have. So if we wanted to have an actual conversation about exercise selection for particular goals, where would we begin? When you said there's some fundamental principles we could use, let's talk maybe, I guess, hypertrophy to narrow it down, because we've spoken, Eric and myself, we've been in the powerlifting space for a minute, strength. We've talked to a lot of world champions, but in our heart of hearts, we're all about getting yucky. We bring up your peak biceps from over a decade ago. Talk to us about principles, then talk to us about exercise selection in general for hypertrophy. What are some of the guiding metrics then, if EMG has completely fallen by the wayside, gone the way of the dinosaurs, gone the way of Anaconda circa 2010?
Which, by the way, is 65% leucine-rich, quote-unquote, hydrolyzed casein.
Oh,
15% L-leucine, 10% creatine, and then 10% citrulline malate.
Did you say leucine and then L-leucine?
So it's, leucine-rich, quote unquote, it's hydrolyzed casein, because that just has leucine in it, and then L-leucine, and then creatine, and then citrulline malate.
And Andrew, I brought it before we jump to the actual question. I brought up your bottle because I could be wrong, and this is just like my memory from that time. I swear it came because you needed to dilute it due to stomach cramps with the amount of creatine. I think it came with a limited edition blue bottle that was either 1 or 2 liters. That's I was cracking that joke earlier.
Yeah, I didn't read T Nation that closely. I'm proud to say.
Yeah. So sorry, you were saying.
Okay, so guiding principles. I mean, in my mind, first we have functional anatomy. We have a general idea of what motions muscles help us perform. So presumably loading the motion that a muscle helps you perform loads the muscle. I mean, then if you know mechanics, you can start to get at ways to increase or decrease leverage to put more stress on that muscle. But then if you look at the actual literature, there are principles you can take away from that as well. So for example, we have the high load versus low load stuff. And that basically tells us, well, so long as we go to failure or close to failure, it really doesn't make a difference. We can use a spectrum of different loads and we can get adequate hypertrophy. In my mind, that's a beautiful thing. That gives us an abundance of options. I mean, there's also some of this recent literature which is starting to suggest that longer muscle lengths seem to be more beneficial than shorter muscle lengths. Whether or not it's better to do both, I'm not completely sure, but maybe that's something to keep in mind. We shouldn't shy away from longer muscle length work. It might hurt in the short term, but it seems to be better in the long term. I mean, I also think these aren't really high stakes problems. We can.
This man comes on a bodybuilding podcast and tells us that we have first world
really
problems. Look at us.
You don't have your problems aren't your problems.
So we have a bunch of evidence about the importance of volume and all of this stuff. Again, those serve as general principles. We don't have exact studies for exact exercise routines, really. We don't really know what's optimal. We don't and presumably the human body is a dynamical system. It's going to depend on what you did for your last program, probably. It's probably going to depend on your diet. It's probably going to depend on many factors. It's a very noisy system. A lot of the studies that we have are also, in the grand scheme of things, very short term. A lot of the outcome measures aren't super great. I mean, you can have ultrasound, so the thickness of a muscle, but that's probably nowhere near as robust as muscle volume, for instance. Like we know different parts of the muscle may grow differently, so you may miss out on effects, or you might make claims that might average out. So, for example, maybe you measure greater hypertrophy with one routine in the proximal part of the muscle, but then maybe the other routine is better for distal part of the muscle and you didn't measure the distal part of the muscle, something like that. But basically, yeah, there are limitations to a lot of the science that's done. And so, like I was saying, this isn't hugely high stakes. So whether or not you miss out on a millimeter or two of growth, I'm not sure it's going to matter in the grand scheme of things.
Again,
damn.
I think you just got to get back in that mindset you had that was objectively more accurate from a decade or more ago, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't shy away from a lot of the bro science in a sense. The coaches have a bunch of experience. Like presumably that experience means something. So, and they integrate that experience with some of the more robust evidence we have, with some of the principles we have, and maybe that's enough. So not we don't need a PubMed citation for every decision we make, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm getting at. It's not like we're giving cancer therapy. It's not like these people are going to live or die depending on which therapy we give them.
Yep.
And I think that it's important to put those things into perspective.
I think so too. And as much as I was being facetious, I agree. And I think there's also, I think it's definitely sufficient to operate with on the limited evidence we have, and then combine that with hopefully well-observed anecdotes, versus what I think more often happens is something gets repeated by someone with a lot of followers who may not even be a coach. It's just this happened to work for the N equals 1 of that very typically extreme outlier responder, and then it gets popularized, and then everyone else says it works. But I think if we are talking about coaches, go ahead.
So here would be a fun study. So if you strongly believe evidence-based choices work, design a study where you have take some super bro coach.
And Andrew's going to bet on the bro coach, I bet. Go on.
I don't know. It doesn't make a difference.
Amazing.
So yeah, take some really bro coach. Take the cutting edge recommendations from the literature. And do we think the cutting edge recommendations from the literature will strongly beat out the bro coach? I don't know that that's totally clear. I think maybe at the end of the day, a lot of bro coaches are doing something that's actually pretty close to what's being done in the literature. And maybe these things won't really be too different and actually play out too differently in the long term. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But
no, I would agree, because I think if we're talking, especially if we're talking about people who actually are coaches, and if we're talking about people who are in the realm of bodybuilding, you can only get it so wrong, right? Like, you're not going to find people who are like, actually, eating protein and progressive overload, I don't do that with my athletes. I put everyone on starvation diets that only consists of carbohydrate and nothing else. And yeah, we just try to get further from failure with lighter loads for fewer reps every session to session, so I think that is actually to have a meta conversation here. It is absolutely a false comparison, with what we consider like the bro approach versus science sometimes. I've definitely had people, because their perception of what is evidence-based is based upon what is currently popularly discussed among people who consider themselves evidence-based rather than based on the literature. And they're like, hey, I'm training more each muscle group more than once a week. This is like circa 5 years ago. And, I'm tracking my RPE, and I'm controlling proximity to failure. And, I'm getting at least X amount of protein, but not more than that because it's a waste. And I'm not worried about the peri-workout window, like all this stuff, that a bunch of things that are basically neutral and removing things that are unnecessary, which especially during kind of the peak of the evidence-based era of just, busting myths rather than actually providing new protocols. You're basically removing things that don't make a difference rather than making fundamental differences between what the quote unquote bro and the evidence-based practitioner is doing. So I think I 100% agree that on average, you might just be a little, I don't know, more mentally healthy and have a few extra hours in your day, but you might not grow anymore,
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe it's more efficient, and maybe that's huge for some people, and that's important.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I guess, growth, maybe the outcomes are pretty similar. I was going to say something relevant to this. Maybe it'll come back to me. Probably not.
All good. I'll give you some time to think. I will say, though, I think I really enjoy when science is conducted where it's not just necessarily confirming or disconfirming things that already exist in practice, but are experimental ideas that are being tested. Like, hey, this is a relatively novel way to track this variable, or a new approach to training. Like, what if we did long muscle length, partials as opposed to, full range of motion? So I think that stuff's interesting. I have personally conducted a mixture of research like that, because sometimes there are practices which are ubiquitous that really haven't been looked at, which I think at best is going to get you more towards the efficient or non-efficient side of things, like you were saying, Andrew. If you can go, oh yeah, this general principle is right, but wow, we're really overdoing the amount of protein that we think we need in those conditions. But also, I think really where you have potential to see something quite interesting is when you test creative solutions to problems, which I think is very interesting. We need both, of course, but it is really cool when you see something pop up that is like, oh shit, no one's doing that because they hadn't thought of it, but that's a very unique application. And now we actually have empirical evidence for it.
Yeah. So I remember what I was going to say before, and even so within the literature, it's pretty common that we see huge time effects, right? But very small group by time effects.
Mm.
So both groups usually grow a good amount, but the difference between the groups is usually pretty small in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, like you said, I mean, within the past 10, 15 years, we've seen two pretty big ideas emerge from the literature. The high load versus low load, and now the muscle length stuff is starting to emerge.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, that emerged from the literature, from what I understand. I don't think those were big in gyms at all, really, before this.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing you'd have to that would be certain camps who believed that higher load or lower load training was better, but there was really never, there was not much acknowledgement across the aisle, for one. Yeah.
And those were more arguments within the literature, from what I understand, than they were in the gym. No coach was like, oh, he's a low load coach, don't use him.
That's true. That's definitely true. Yeah, I think you will get different applications of different loading zones in like kind of the community, but yeah, a lot of the times it's kind of always hanging out in the moderate range, which is interesting. Also, like blood flow restriction. Yes, you do have the HIIT people for sure, and you have the people who tended to have like a powerlifting bias. But yeah, another one like blood flow restriction training. That's pretty much exclusively originated from the literature. So it absolutely does happen. And I think it's really cool when that happens. But yeah, I can't.
But maybe we should be focusing more on those ideas, right? Like theory development, in a sense.
Yes, I totally agree. And then we'd get a lot less of these critiques of, yeah, the coaches are ahead of the science. And it's like, you're not 100% wrong, bro. But, like the directionality, the interesting thing I find with that is I think coaches often are ahead of the science when the science is just trying to disconfirm or confirm things. But they're accurate in their directionality, but sometimes way off in the magnitude, because it's kind of like, I'll take it too far because, better safe than sorry type of thing. And I do think that we'll always be a little limited if that's all we're doing in research into really having impact, which I think is what we're getting after.
Yeah, I mean, within medicine, we have bedside to bench to bedside, but we also have bench to bedside, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, ideally, you have both to kind of ensure ideas are flowing.
Absolutely.
I will say I do see the utility, even if basically you're just disconfirming things, that the utility is that you need to quantify and measure it in some sort of respect. So you can say this thing isn't really a thing and it doesn't matter. If the end outcome is that what someone is doing, it can work both ways, or what someone that espouses bro science, in the end, it still works. Investigating is still worthwhile. It's just the utility of it is in either disconfirming that there's any significant difference, rather than, oh my God, like I followed this approach here and it's so much superior. It's simply knowing, maybe allocating why, and also just investigating in the first place to see if there was anything there. There probably would be no meaningful differences. And I think maybe one of the points is that in the community, people get so caught up in terms of either trying to like knowledge shame people in terms of like, oh, like you don't know what you're talking about, this and that, or also be so sure of things that they're saying that like you really don't know, or really, maybe to Andrew's point, it doesn't matter in the long run. So there's overstated importance. But I think the people actually doing the research, putting in the time to investigate some of these things, there's still that high utility of simply knowing.
Yeah, attenuating hype.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
A little bit of consumer protection, right? If we can say that these things are within your realm to manipulate to your personal preference or circumstance, or that it can only be so much of a large effect, so that when something does come around, you have solid ground to be like, hey, let's pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it also helps maybe this is what you're getting at with consumer protection, but one of the most egregious things in my mind is making claims as if they're based on the scientific literature or grounded in strong, rigorous science, but that's just this person's marketing.
Mm.
Yes.
Go on.
The misrepresentation of science. Well, the misrepresentation of science for personal benefit. It's science is a tool we use to try to understand the world around us. It's not something you should use to. Well, it's not something you should misrepresent to sell your products or gain followers or something like that. It's a process.
Well, fortunately, that never happens, Andrew.
And likewise, I guess while I'm going off on this, biomechanics and functional anatomy are not the same thing. Have I discussed this before?
Not here.
Go on with your bad self.
Biomechanics is the use of, so mechanics, the field that uses physics to study objects that move. So forces and motion and stuff like that. Okay, anyway, so functional anatomy is just the study of anatomy as it relates to movement. Mechanics puts numbers on those things. It puts equations on those things. So simply looking at muscle fibers or looking at a joint or looking at the anatomy, that's not mechanics. Mechanics is the process of quantifying these things and modeling these things, and it's a rigorous field. So I guess within the online exercise community, I get somewhat frustrated by misrepresentations of the biomechanics people,
right,
and what they're doing and what they're saying, where they're just qualitatively looking at anatomy and not doing the work necessary to actually quantify and carry through the steps necessary to make mechanical claims.
Right. So is it your position that so long as if they represent what they're doing with the appropriate level of what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, intellectual honesty and the confidence behind their claims. That's the word I was looking for. So long as that matches the kind of qualitative descriptive nature of the fact that they're doing functional anatomy rather than biomechanics, probably beneficial rather than potentially harmful if they are assuming that their assessments of functional anatomy are just as valid as a peer-reviewed biomechanics study where those things have been quantified and proven.
Yeah. And I mean, there are certain qualitative principles that you can take away from biomechanics that relate directly to mechanics itself, such as the ideas of leverage and stuff like that. And you can make those sorts of claims, but you can only go so far with them. And I think knowing where to stop, I don't know, I err on the side of caution with these things.
I think that's probably best. Don't you dare apologize. No, I think that's really good stuff, and I think it's really helpful. And there's a lot of take homes here. I know we've had a relatively nuanced discussion in some parts, but I think the big picture stuff here is a lot of the quote unquote science that we have to help people with exercise selection that are present in kind of the overall evidence-based communities groupthink. They're a lot more limited than we might suspect at face value based upon the amount of literature, the claims in the literature. So this is not one of those instances like we've talked about in Iron Culture many times where the science is misrepresented by the people talking about science. Unfortunately, a lot of the science itself misrepresents the limitations of the actual mechanisms the methodologies that are being used. So I don't think any of us are claiming that some trainer who is well read is at fault for suggesting that this study suggests that the lateral raise is better, or that cable rows are great for the middle deltoid, because they are actually reading that in a study, and that is the implicit or explicit claim of the researchers. And I don't think it's fair to put the burden of accurate representation on the person who is not the actual researcher when they are a consumer of said research. So I think this is helpful. It has a lot of utility. It's not just folks in 2011 who are misinterpreting EMG data. It still absolutely happens to this day. I myself have done it, and have been trying to get better over time. Because again, I have done some EMG research, but I would not consider myself an EMG researcher. And as a science communicator, you have to be continually attentive to the limits of your knowledge to make sure that you're accurately representing things. So as always, I'm very appreciative that you're able to take the time to explain not only limitations of EMG, how we could make it better, what it can do, which as a review for everyone listening, is the muscle on or off? And then also, like, when would it be on and off in a more complex movement? It would be able to tell us that. And then potentially what steps could be taken in the future to help us actually validate EMG and understand the limits of it, which would help us be much more efficient in our research for the future. And then potentially other avenues where there may be proxies that we basically have an absence of evidence, and that we really need to be relying on actual measurements of longitudinal hypertrophy. However, in their absence, there's nothing wrong with the principal functional anatomy-based assessment, so long as we match the level of confidence we have to that level of evidence, which is inherently limited, but probably sufficient to get the job done. How did I do, Andrew? Did I represent your position well?
Great. Just one thing to add. So one thing to note, EMG is a perfectly valid tool for valid implementations that might sound tautological, but EMG was not originally created to select exercises, right? It was used to study the nervous system and how it interacts with muscles. So it's very useful from a motor control standpoint and for answering a lot of basic motor control questions. So this kind of hypertrophy-centric way of looking at things is it's hypertrophy-centric, right? But that's not to say EMG is an invalid tool. It's perfectly fine for a lot of its original intended uses.
Beautiful. I think it's best to look at this as you use a hammer to put nails in the wall. You don't use it to screw screws. So we're not throwing EMG out because, hey, if you want to understand things about motor control, like Andrew was saying, and there's a lot of actually unanswered questions that could benefit from EMG that are actually specific and relevant to bodybuilding and strength training, like to the nature of fatigue, the specific source of it, time course of it, and what causes different types of fatigue, that I think EMG is really useful for. So don't start. What we don't want you to do, dear Iron Culture listeners, is to see a study that uses EMG and be like, trash, nah, I'm hip to the new vibe on Iron Culture. Omar, is that what kids say these days? Hip to the new vibe?
They do it in a dance on TikTok, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, whether they're implicitly doing that with their TikTok moves or saying it outwardly like we used to do back in the day, if you think you're hip to the new vibe and that new vibe is EMG is out, it's canceled, no. It just needs to be used appropriately. So I appreciate that clarification, Andrew. I appreciate your time. Omar, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on?
No, Andrew, it's always fantastic having you on, man. And this is your first solo time, Andrew says, and my last. I'm like, damn, say you left the lifting community louder. Thanks for making us feel all worthless. I do think, I know you are, in all seriousness, doing some very rigorous work, but I do think you probably would have enjoyed our meta conversation, myself and Eric, talking about the egregious use of science as a marketing tool by marketers or people in the space to self-promote or more align themselves with the right choice and use, once again, the public's assumption of what science is or like what claims they can make in order to basically derive more monetary compensation, which actually is one of our pet peeves, which could have been its own whole other conversation. But I am glad you brought that up. Thanks as always for being on. Last but not least, I know you're like, I literally, if someone asks me a hypertrophy question, I'm going to lose my shit, but we're contractually obligated to ask every single guest, as our service to the guest, where can people find you? I know you don't want them to message you, but if you want to shout yourself out, is there anything you want to shout out, my man, before we close out the episode?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm Vigotsky, ResearchGate, or Google Scholar.
Sure.
I also have a website, andrewvigotsky.com.
Nice.
That essentially is just a list of publications.
Fantastic.
Bam.
No. Yeah. We'll link that in the description. Don't you dare ask him a question though, or go ahead and I don't know. Go ahead and do your
Tweet
thing.
at your boy.
Tweet at A Vigotsky. Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave us a rating and review. Andrew, we're in the health and fitness space on iTunes. We regularly rank within the top 200. We're the number one fitness podcast, but we're number 154 in health and fitness. How is that possible, you ask? Well, there's many sexual health podcasts, and I'm not even joking when I say this, far ahead of us, and that's okay. We're considering a career switch. You could go ahead and leave that rating review, especially after this episode, a career switch. 5 stars is typically what people leave, but what's up, Eric?
Omar, but when are we going to be back for this next episode?
Oh, that's a good question. Folks, we're not back this coming Monday for this episode. It's a weird scheduling conflict with the algorithm, the corporate cabal that organizes Iron Culture said don't release on the next Monday. It's a bad Monday. We don't know what that means. April 1st is the day to be released the next episode, so we're missing a few days. We'll be back April 1st for a special episode. Tune in for that one. We'll catch you in that next episode.